The Sustainable Development Goals come into effect on the 1st of January 2016. Unlike the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals will apply to all countries, including Australia. The Monash Sustainability Institute and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network are holding a series of workshops to determine how the Sustainable Development Goals should apply in Australia. What are appropriate targets? And what is the role of different sectors in implementing the goals? Business, academia, government and the non-government sector.
Business isn't going to invest or isn't going to contribute or be able to help implement sustainable development goals without a business case for, investing people, investing time.
I think probably the first real opportunity is for the academics that mostly identify with sustainable development with their research and education to really be talking to their colleagues and other people in other areas such as philosophy and music and history, and helping them see how their research fundamentally contributes to sustainable development.
If you look at the goals, and it took some time, and this is not going to surprise you, they are inextricably linked. You've got economy, you've got environment, you've got social inclusion, you've got the goals as your halo. What I think is missing is an emotional connection. Again, we find this all the time when we're dealing with behaviour change.
The United Nations has come up with a proposal to have 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 specific targets. One of the big challenges now is to see what are the implications for Australia. Which of those goals, which of those targets are most relevant for Australia?
We split into 7 tables so that each group was discussing 1, 2 or 3 of the goals. And then we put all of the targets that represented those goals, and what we asked them to do is to rate the issues that were raised by those targets for their importance for Australia. So was it a high priority for Australia? So if you look here at the one for cities and human settlements, by 2030 provide access to safe, affordable, accessible, sustainable transport systems. That was deemed by the group to be a high priority for Australia. So we went through all of the goals and targets and assigned a priority for Australia for each of the targets. So we now have an assigned priority for all 169 targets.
Sustainable number 3 is about health. It's the only one around health specifically. And we were asked to look at it in the context of Australia. So the figures start off with maternal and child health, which in Australia overall is very, very good. We're about 6.8 per 100,000 maternal deaths. However, when you take out of that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health statistics, it's actually, the statistics to that group are much worse.
The top 3 goals specifically relate to Indigenous people in Australia. So poverty is mainly related to Indigenous people, where we need economic development of Aboriginal lands, and it's the number 1 goal of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think Australia, that's where we need to support that effort. 2 is about sustainable agriculture. Well, carbon farming is a measure of sustainable agriculture, and healthy lifestyles. Well, certainly Indigenous people need to have greater support for healthy lifestyles. They're the top 3 goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, and they specifically apply to Indigenous Australia, and that's where our effort should be made.
The areas that were really high priority was the significant impact of what we call the non-communicable diseases, or in Australia we call it the chronic diseases. So the disease burden from lifestyle choices and diseases including diabetes, obesity and the consequent heart disease and stroke is massive.
As well as getting them to rate each of the targets by priority, what we also asked them to do was to look at those targets and try and draft Australia-specific targets for those. So how would Australia interpret those open working group targets to achieve sustainable development in Australia.
Preventable illness from substance abuse, again, including alcohol, this is big, but we have got some methodology around it. It's not the most important one, but it's still very, very significant.
One of the most important issues is to recognise that to incorporate the concept of sustainable development and to implement the sustainable development will require all actors, all stakeholders, all sectors. It will require government, local, state and federal. It will require businesses. It will require civil society and academia. So one of the key questions we ask ourselves is, what are the roles and responsibilities of each of these sectors? And equally important, what are the actions that really need to be taken in the next 6 months to a couple of years to actually move us on that pathway to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals?
Okay, in the second set of breakout groups, we wanted to understand what the role of the different actors in achieving Sustainable Development Goals were. So what was the role of the federal government? What was the role of state governments, local government, business, civil society, NGOs, academia? So what we did, we broke into 5 different groups of federal government, state and local government, NGOs and civil society, academia and business. And we asked each of those really 2 key questions. The first is, what do they see their role as in terms of implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals? And then secondly, what concrete actions was that sector going to take over the next 6 to 12 months? Because after all, the Sustainable Development Goals are going to become operational at the beginning of 2016. What specific actions is that sector going to have to take to set us on the road of implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals?
So you actually set up programs. Who's going to report back against the goals? And that's where it starts. Reinforcement of that through professional parts of the community to help the federal government. So you need leadership. Someone has to convene it. That should be actually the federal government.
One area where the SDGs I think are already influencing what the federal government is doing is in data collection and analysis and monitoring.
All right, fourth estate.
An aid campaign should be explicitly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Should be rehearsing your report back, ready to feed anything back into the group in the next few minutes.
What are the concrete actions that the federal government should take this year to begin for implementation? There are a number of different suggestions, but the overriding theme from this group was that the federal government's role is to provide leadership. The important role of other sectors for the federal government was to reduce the risk of federal government engagement and intervention.
This idea that the SDGs could be a centrally coordinating agenda across all levels came through strongly. So a way to start harmonising out of the stovepipes that we spoke about yesterday. So looking at the market transformational potential of leading by example and aligning procuring and purchasing to SDG goals.
And really creating the narrative around the future focus. What are the risks of not participating? What are the opportunities of making sure that we do participate and communicating that relevance?
And we really saw, in terms of the influence of the SDGs, that it can really provide a galvanising point and a sort of framework for cooperation for civil society, as the SDGs as an accountability mechanism. So accountability mechanism both for the work of civil society, but also to be able to hold governments and private sector to account in this area as well. And the last bit in terms of the influence, that also this should be the SDGs should also be used to sort of, for civil society to prioritise its work both across sectors and geographically as well.
An important aspect which I hadn't actually thought about is if the SDGs are built into tenders, research tenders with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and some of those institutions, that will clearly focus the minds of the Vice-Chancellors if they have to consider SDGs if they're going to win those research grants. Really, the Vice-Chancellors, particularly the Group of 8, should sign on to the SDGs. That would be not only symbolic, but I think have a really significant impact on the sector within this country.
please.